So last year I went about solving a bunch of frosting problems, such as making a stable cream cheese buttercream, a non-grainy, non-sweet American buttercream, and at the end of the year things took a creepy turn and I made a no-dye black buttercream, and even a buttercream that glows in UV light. And with every frosting, I learned something new until I realized I have all of the information I need. And now I have a new method to make buttercream that is flavor first, meaning the butter is a vessel to present the flavor and not overpower it. Texture-wise, it's very smooth and creamy because of the dissolved sugar. Because my method prioritizes flavoring ingredient, I can not only make frostings unlike any other frosting you've tasted, they also have a strikingly beautiful natural color. Now, I wasn't really able to achieve this until I studied a bunch of buttercreams and I saw they all follow a common formula, inside which there is a huge window of opportunity to enhance flavor and intensify color that I've never seen used in this way. So to illustrate, I've made this chart on 8 buttercreams that I tested in an earlier video. And you can think of these emulsion type buttercreams in 2 parts. One component is the butter in yellow and the other component in shades of blue. And I'll just refer to this collectively as the flavor base. Contains water and sugar, proteins from eggs and milk, and sometimes additional starches like flour. Now notice how all the butter amounts are relatively similar. And generally you cannot mess with the butter amount in a buttercream. That ranges from around 40 to 55% of the total recipe. That is required for stability and emulsifying, meaning it has the component inside that enables the frosting to come together and get that smooth and creamy feel. Additionally, you cannot mess with the total amount of the flavor base. You can only offset this ratio so much before the buttercream emulsion breaks. Now, typically, if you wanted to add flavor, you could add extracts, maybe a little bit of jam or dried powders like cocoa powder. Usually the flavoring ingredient inside a flavor base makes up a very small percentage of the total buttercream. But then I wondered if I could increase the flavoring ingredient within the flavor base. I'd have to shift things around a bit since the bulk of most of these buttercreams flavor base is taken up by eggs and other things. But that gives me around 40 to 50% of a recipe to mess with. And that's how I solved all those problems in the beginning of the video. And you can use various liquids from milks to creams, but ideally you'll want something that not only has dissolved sugars like a syrup, but also has a small portion of starches and proteins and fats dedicated for texture, stability, and sometimes color. Now the actual math and temperatures will always vary based on the amount of starches and proteins in the syrup, and I'll always figure those out for us in the recipe. Okay, I'm gonna show you how I make my no-dye red velvet frosting. It's what I used here on my inside out red velvet cake. And just to preface, I don't like red velvet, but this frosting is so good that if I owned a bakery, which I don't plan on doing, this would be a signature flavor that I would use. It's a little bit fruity and tangy, has a strong vanilla flavor with a hint of cocoa at the end. For this one, I'll need the ingredients for the flavor base, which are red beet powder. Do not be afraid of this because it imparts a fruity, acidic profile to frostings. It's insanely delicious and not at all beety in the way that I use it. I'll also use some cocoa powder. I use black, but you can use natural or Dutch, but your color is going to come out a little differently than mine, and some water, sugar, vanilla, and salt to flavor. For the butter component, we'll need lots of butter cut into 1 to 2 tablespoon chunks and then placed in the freezer for at least 30 minutes so they are frozen. And now I'm gonna make the syrup. And because this one contains a starch, which is the red beet powder as well as the cocoa powder, I'll want to cook that a little first. So I'll add the beetroot powder and cocoa powder along with the water to a saucepan or pan and turn it on to low heat and whisk until most of the starches have been evenly distributed into the water. And it just starts to release steam. It won't be completely smooth, that's fine. I'm just looking to very lightly cook the starches so the end frosting isn't too grainy from too many uncooked starches. Now I'll add in all the sugar and whisk until that sugar is completely dissolved. Then I'm going to turn my heat up to medium-high and using a spatula, scrape the sides periodically and cook until the syrup reaches 230 to 234 Fahrenheit. This temperature is called the syrup stage in sugar cooking, and at this point only around 20% of the water we initially added is left. Additionally, the sugar has melted and will not give a granular feel to the finished frosting. Once I reach the temperature, I'll carefully pour the syrup into my stand mixer bowl and now take that frozen butter and add about 10% of that total amount to the hot syrup. Now put all the butter back into the freezer while the syrup cools. This little chunk of butter added at this stage does a couple things. First, it prevents the sugar syrup from setting up too hard, which would make it too difficult to incorporate into the butter later on. It also greases the bowl with fat so the sugar doesn't harden on the outer perimeter. And lastly, it reduces the temperature. Now we can't add the rest of the butter until the syrup reaches 145 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which depending on your quantity and your air temperature doesn't take usually more than 10 minutes. I also use this time to add salts or any other extra flavor extracts such as vanilla for this buttercream. Okay, once you reach about 150, then add in the rest of the frozen butter and then stir with the spatula. The reason why we can't add all the frozen butter at once is because the emulsifiers get destroyed at high temperatures. And if those are destroyed, your buttercream will look oily or remain soupy and never come together. And once the butter has melted a little bit, you'll probably still have big chunks. It's time to move to the stand mixer to emulsify. And if you're making a buttercream of 6 cups or less on a standard size KitchenAid, you can use the paddle attachment for this entire process. If you're making more than 7 cups, you'll have to use the whisk attachment first and then use the paddle attachment later to smooth the frosting out. Okay, here's what's happening. First, the buttercream is warm and has these frozen little nuggets of butter, and as it slowly reaches room temperature and the butter is melting, the water in the butter is mixing with the syrup and flavoring and coloring it as well. Now, once the mixture is around 68 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, turn the mixer up to medium-high speed. At this point, it's going to go through some textural changes. First, it's going to thicken, maybe like a cake batter. Then it will start to develop these fat little beads, and they'll be pretty small at first, but then as you continue to mix, these fat beads will get a little wider and bigger. Then you'll see the frosting possibly look kind of greasy, and that's the syrup water not yet being picked up by the fat in the butter. Then the mixture will thicken substantially and start to pull away from the sides of the bowl and ball up around the paddle. Mix it for another minute on high speed after this point, and then you can mix it on low speed with the paddle attachment to get out any large air bubbles. Now at this point, you might have to adjust for color intensity. For example, this is my black buttercream using this method, and here's the buttercream straight from the bowl. It's a soft black, maybe a dark charcoal, depending on your lighting. It's also got some brown undertones, but if you need a shiny jet black, what you can do is use an immersion blender. And I've done this for a couple years now because I can't yet afford a big homogenizer like they have in labs, but this is a good household substitute for that type of machinery. Other bakers have told me that you can also use a food processor, though I've never tried. Essentially, a homogenizer is to make all things equal. It cuts the fat droplets into even smaller pieces, and by doing that, removes a bit of air. So the black is more evenly distributed and looks darker to us. Doing this to buttercreams also results in a glossier appearance. Because the fat droplets are smaller and kind of closer together, it'll feel a bit denser and fattier on the palate. So as far as stability, I did frost a cake using my red velvet buttercream, and I left it out for 24 hours at room temperature. I didn't notice any bulging or slumping for my cake. For high temperature stability, these buttercreams are going to be very similar to my American Dreamy buttercream, which I went through in my last video featuring all 8 buttercreams. They are based on that same ratio, and so I would treat them the same.